Imagine driving home late at night, the road stretching out in front of you, like a quiet promise of rest after a long day. Now, picture this. Red and blue lights flash in your rearview mirror, cutting through the stillness. Your heart skips a beat, not because you've done anything wrong, but because you know deep down this could spiral into something far worse than a simple traffic stop. That's exactly what happened to Colonel Maya Harper, a black Air Force officer stationed near Tulsa, Oklahoma. She wasn't just any driver that night. She was a woman who'd spent years serving her country, commanding respect in uniform, leading missions with precision and grace. But on that dark stretch of highway, none of that mattered. Not her rank, not her service, not her spotless record. It was just past midnight when those lights flickered behind her. The air was thick with Oklahoma humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavy. She'd been on duty for 12 hours straight, her mind already drifting to the comfort of her bed. The last thing she expected was a confrontation that would change everything. This isn't just a story about one woman, though. It's a window into something bigger, something that happens far too often. In America, black drivers are twice as likely to be pulled over compared to their white counterparts. That's not a guess. It's a cold, hard fact backed by years of data. And for Maya, that statistic wasn't just a number, it was about to become her reality. She wasn't speeding. Her tags were up to date. Her taillights? Perfectly fine. She'd had them checked just a week before, during a routine maintenance run on base. So why was she being stopped? That question lingered in her mind as she eased her car to the shoulder, hands steady on the wheel, already bracing herself for what might come next. Maya Harper wasn't a stranger to pressure. She'd faced it in the cockpit, in briefing rooms, in moments where split-second decisions meant life or death. But this was different. This wasn't about national security or military strategy. This was personal. This was about the color of her skin, and a system that too often sees it as a threat. The officer who stepped out of that patrol car wasn't just any cop. His name was James Colton, a man with a badge, a gun, and a history that would soon unravel in ways he never saw coming. To him, Maya wasn't a colonel, wasn't a hero. She was just another black face behind the wheel, someone he could flex his authority over without a second thought. What happened next wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a collision of power, prejudice, and resilience, a spark that would ignite a firestorm of justice. This story isn't fiction. It's not some Hollywood script cooked up for drama. It's a real-life battle that peels back the layers of a problem we can't keep ignoring. Think about it. How many times have you heard whispers of stories like this? A routine drive turns into a nightmare. A badge becomes a weapon. A person's dignity gets stripped away under the glare of flashing lights. For Black Americans, it's not a rare headline, it's a lived experience, one that's been documented, debated, and too often dismissed. Maya's journey didn't end on that roadside. It didn't stop when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, or when she sat in a cell, staring at concrete walls. No, this was only the beginning. What unfolded over the next few days would shake the Tulsa Police Department to its core, draw the eyes of the Air Force, and leave a mark that rippled far beyond one woman's fight. This video isn't just about what happened to her. It's about why it keeps happening and what it takes to push back. You're about to see a story of courage, of defiance, of a system forced to reckon with itself. Buckle up, because Maya Harper's fight is one you won't forget. Every second of this tale is a thread in a bigger tapestry. Racial profiling, abuse of power, the quiet strength of those who refuse to bow. By the time we're done, you'll see it all, the raw moments, the courtroom showdown, the fallout that no one could ignore. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel that spark too, the one that says, enough is enough. So let's start where it all began. A lonely road near Tulsa, a woman in uniform, and a night that would rewrite the rules. This is Justice Rising, the fight of Maya Harper. Stick around. You're in for one hell of a ride. The night was pitch black outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. The kind of dark where the stars feel like they've given up shining. Maya Harper was behind the wheel, her headlights slicing through the emptiness. The hum of her engine the only sound breaking the silence. She was bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that sinks into your marrow after a long shift at the Air Force Base. All she wanted was to get home, kick off her boots, and let the world fade away for a few hours. Then it happened. A flicker of red and blue danced in her rearview mirror. At first, it was just a speck like a firefly caught in the distance, but it grew fast, too fast. Her stomach tightened. Not because she was speeding, she wasn't. Not because her tags were expired, they weren't. But because she knew, in that deep, unspoken way, that this wasn't going to be simple. She eased her foot off the gas, guiding her car to the gravel shoulder, with the precision of someone who'd flown missions under pressure. The patrol car pulled up close behind, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat she couldn't escape. She kept her hands on the wheel. 10 and 2, just like they teach you, stay calm, stay visible. Don't give them a reason. Her mind raced, but her face stayed steady. Years in uniform had taught her how to lock panic behind a steel door. The door of the patrol car swung open, and out stepped James Colton. He wasn't a small man, broad shoulders, a swagger in his step, the kind of guy who carried his badge like it was a crown. His flashlight cut through the night, a beam so bright it made her squint as he approached her window. She rolled it down, the cool air rushing in, mixing with the faint scent of oil and dust from the road. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how her night was going. No pleasantries, no preamble, just a voice sharp enough to slice through metal. License and registration. That was it. No explanation, no courtesy. She reached for her glove box, slow and deliberate, pulling out the papers with hands that didn't shake, not yet. She handed them over, her military ID tucked in with the rest, a silent testament to who she was. He barely glanced at them. His eyes flicked over her, sizing her up in a way that made her skin crawl. Your taillight's out, he said, tossing the words out like they were fact, not a question. She blinked, caught off guard. That's not possible. I had it checked last week. Everything was fine. Her voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who knew how to keep a situation from boiling over. He didn't like that. His jaw tightened, a flash of something dark crossing his face. I said it's out. Don't argue with me. The words snapped out, quick and hard, like he was daring her to push back. She took a breath, steadying herself. I'm not arguing. I'm just saying it was fine a few days ago. Can I ask why you stopped me? It wasn't a challenge, just a question, clear and firm, the kind she'd asked 100 times in debriefs. That's when it shifted. His flashlight dropped a little, but his glare didn't. Step out of the car. It wasn't a request, it was an order, barked with a venom that made her pulse jump. She paused, just for a second, weighing her options. I have a right to know why. Her voice stayed even, but there was steel in it now, the kind forged in years of standing her ground. Out. Now. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt, not quite on his gun, but close enough to send a message. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on her chest. She knew this moment. She'd heard the stories, seen the videos, felt the weight of them in quiet conversations with friends and family. This wasn't about a taillight. This was about power, and she wasn't the one holding it. She unbuckled her seatbelt, slow and deliberate, keeping her movement smooth. The door creaked as she pushed it open, her boots hitting the gravel with a soft crunch. She stood tall, shoulders back, her uniform jacket still on from the base, a silent reminder of who she was. But to him, it didn't matter. He wasn't seeing a colonel. He wasn't seeing a person. He was seeing a target. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass along the roadside. A faint whisper against the pounding in her ears. Colton circled her like a predator, his flashlight swinging back up, blinding her for a moment. You don't get to question me, he growled, his voice low and thick with disdain. She squinted against the light, holding her ground. I'm not questioning you. I'm asking for clarity. That's my right? He laughed, a short, harsh sound that didn't reach his eyes. Your rights don't mean squat out here. The words landed like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse than this hostile skies. Impossible odds, but this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield she could navigate with a flight plan. This was raw, messy, personal. He stepped in closer, his shadow swallowing hers under the glare of those flashing lights. "Turn around," he said, his tone shifting from sharp to cold, like he'd already made up his mind. She frowned, her patience thinning. "Why? What's the reason?" Her voice rose just enough to carry over the hum of the patrol car, but she kept it steady, refusing to let him rattle her. That was it, the line he wouldn't let her cross. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a grip that bruised, twisting her toward the car. I said, "Turn around." The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beams spinning wild across the pavement, throwing jagged shadows into the night. Her breath hitched, but she didn't resist, not yet. She knew better than to give him an excuse. The cuffs came next, cold and unforgiving, snapping around her wrists before she could process it. He yanked them tight, the metal digging in, a deliberate jab of pain that made her jaw clench. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice low, a warning wrapped in calm. He didn't answer, just shoved her toward the patrol car, his boots kicking up dust as he moved. The door swung open, and he pushed her forward, her hip brushing the frame as she ducked inside. The back seat smelled like vinyl and sweat, the kind of stale air that sticks to you. He slammed the door shut, the sound ringing in her ears, final and heavy. Through the window, she watched him scoop up his flashlight, brushing it off with a smirk, like he'd just checked something off a list. She sat there, hands pinned behind her, the cuffs cutting into her skin, with every bump in the road ahead. Her mind was a storm: anger, disbelief, a quiet fury building beneath her calm. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Colton thought he'd won this round, but he didn't know who he was dealing with. Not yet. The lights kept flashing, red and blue bleeding into the night, a signal to no one but her. This was just the beginning, a spark that would grow, a fight that would burn. And as the car pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires, Maya Harper made a promise to herself. He'd regret this, every single second of it. The gravel crunched under Maya Harper's boots as she stood there, facing James Colton on that lonely stretch of road near Tulsa. The night air was thick, heavy with the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Her arm still stung where he'd grabbed her, his fingers leaving a faint ache she refused to acknowledge. She kept her chin up, eyes locked on him, searching for some hint of reason in his glare. There wasn't any. He didn't waste time. "Hands behind your back," he barked, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt with a metallic clink that echoed in the stillness. Her stomach twisted, but her face didn't show it. Years of training had taught her how to bury fear, how to stand tall when everything inside screamed to run. "This isn't necessary," she said, her voice steady, slicing through the tension like a blade. "I haven't done anything wrong." He didn't care, didn't even blink. The cuffs snapped around her wrists before she could finish the sentence, cold steel biting into her skin. He yanked them tight, too tight, deliberately, like he wanted her to feel it. A sharp sting shot up her arms, but she didn't wince. She wouldn't give him that. Her jaw clenched, her breathing slowed, every ounce of her willpower focused on staying composed. The patrol car's lights kept flashing, red and blue painting the scene in jagged streaks. Colton shoved her toward the vehicle, his grip rough, his boots stomping the ground like he owned it. "You're under arrest," he muttered, the words dripping with smugness. Like he'd just won some game. She didn't even know they were playing. "For what?" she asked, her tone sharp now, cutting through his bravado. Obstructing an officer, he shot back, not even looking at her. The absurdity hit her like a punch. Obstructing? For asking a question? For existing? She wanted to laugh, but the weight of those cuffs kept the sound locked in her throat. This wasn't about law. This was about him, his ego, his power, his need to dominate. And she was the one paying for it. He opened the back door of the patrol car, pushing her in with a force that made her stumble. Her shoulder banged against the frame, a dull thud ringing out. But she caught herself, sliding onto the hard seat with as much dignity as she could muster. The door slammed shut, the sound final, like a gavel dropping. Through the window, she saw him pick up his flashlight, brushing it off like nothing had happened. The drive to the Tulsa police station was a blur. The road stretched out in front of them, headlights carving a path through the dark. But inside that car, time felt frozen. Her wrists throbbed where the cuffs dug in, the metal rubbing raw against her skin. She shifted slightly, testing the give there wasn't any. Colton sat up front, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping idly against the dash, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. She stared at the back of his head, her mind racing. This wasn't her first brush with disrespect. Years in the military had shown her plenty, but this was different. This was personal, raw, stripped of any pretense. He didn't know who she was, didn't care. To him, she was just another black woman he could toss around, another notch on his belt of control. They pulled up to the station, a squat brick building glowing under harsh fluorescent lights. He yanked the door open, motioning her out with a lazy flick of his hand. She stepped onto the pavement, the cuffs forcing her shoulders back, her posture rigid. He marched her inside, past a desk where a younger officer sat, his eyes flicking up from a stack of papers. That was Ethan Parker. He was new, barely a shadow in the room, his uniform still crisp, his face unlined by the years Colton had spent hardening into arrogance. He glanced at Maya, then at Colton, his mouth twitching like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. "Booker," Colton snapped, shoving her toward the desk. Ethan hesitated, his fingers fumbling with the pen, his gaze darting between them. The station smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of place that sucked the life out of you the second you walked in. Colton leaned against the counter, arms crossed, that smirk still plastered on his face. "Obstruction," he repeated, louder this time, like he was proud of it. Ethan nodded, scribbling something down, but his hands shook just enough to notice. He didn't look at Maya, not really, like he was afraid of what he'd see. They took her to a holding room, a concrete box with a single flickering bulb overhead. The cuffs came off, finally, leaving red welts on her wrists she didn't bother rubbing. She sat on the bench, back straight, staring at the door. Colton lingered for a moment, watching her through the glass, his eyes glinting with something ugly satisfaction. Maybe, or just spite. "You're not getting out of this," he said, his voice low, almost a taunt. She didn't respond, didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything she could have thrown back at him. He turned away, chuckling to himself, the sound bouncing off the walls as he disappeared down the hall. But Maya wasn't broken, not even close. Sitting there, in that cold gray room, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the end. It was the start. Her mind was already moving, piecing together what came next, how to turn this nightmare into something he'd regret. She'd faced worse than James Colton, and she'd come out on top every time. Ethan lingered outside, his shadow passing the door every few minutes. He didn't say a word, didn't step in, but his unease hung in the air like smoke. He'd seen it all, the cuffs, the smirk, the way Colton strutted out of there. And somewhere, deep down, he knew this wasn't right. But for now, he stayed quiet, a witness too afraid to act. The clock on the wall ticked slow, each second stretching out like a lifetime. Maya closed her eyes, breathing deep, letting the anger settle into something sharper resolve. She wasn't just a prisoner in that moment. She was a colonel, a fighter, a woman who'd never let a man like Colton define her. And soon, he'd find out exactly who he'd messed with. The holding cell was a concrete coffin, its walls cold and gray, swallowing every sound but the faint hum of that flickering bulb overhead. Maya Harper sat on the narrow bench, her back straight, her wrists still raw from where the cuffs had bitten into her skin. The air smelled like bleach and despair, thick enough to choke on if you let it. She didn't. She wouldn't. Not now, not ever. Her boots rested flat on the floor, steady, like she was still in control even here. locked behind a steel door in the Tulsa police station. The silence pressed in, heavy and relentless, but her mind was anything but quiet. It churned, sharp and focused, replaying every second of that roadside nightmare. Colton's smirk, the snap of the cuffs, the way he'd strutted off like he'd won something. She flexed her fingers, wincing as the soreness flared up her arms. They hadn't even given her a phone call yet, not officially, but she wasn't waiting for their permission. She'd spotted a payphone in the hall when they marched her in, and she'd memorized the layout, old habits from years of tactical training. One chance. That's all she needed. The door creaked open. Just a sliver, and a shadow passed by. Ethan Parker, the young officer with the shaky hands. He didn't look in, didn't say a word, just hovered like a ghost, too scared to haunt. She seized the moment. "Hey," she called, her voice low but firm, cutting through the stillness. "I get a call, right? That's the rule." He froze, his silhouette stiffening, then nodded once before disappearing. Minutes later, they let her out just long enough to reach that phone. The receiver was cold in her hand, the dial tone buzzing like a lifeline. She punched in the number she knew by heart, each beep a small rebellion against the mess she was in. It rang twice before a voice picked up, deep and steady, the kind that carried weight even through static. "Ridley here." Colonel John Ridley, her commanding officer, her mentor, the man who'd seen her through hell and back in the Air Force. She didn't waste time. "It's Maya. I'm in Tulsa PD. They stopped me, cuffed me, locked me up. No reason, just some cop with a grudge." Her words were clipped, precise, but the anger simmered beneath them, hot and alive. There was a pause on the other end, a sharp intake of breath. "What the hell happened?" His tone shifted, hard now, like he was already halfway out the door. She told him everything. The fake taillight excuse, the cuffs, the smug bastard who'd dragged her here. "I need you to move on this," she finished, glancing at the clock on the wall. "They're not letting this go easy." "I've got you," he said, and she could hear the fire in his voice, the kind that meant action, not just promises. "Sit tight. I'm making calls. This ends tonight." The line clicked off, and she hung up, her pulse steadying for the first time since those lights flashed in her mirror. Ridley wasn't just a colonel, he was a force, a man who'd topple mountains if his people were on the line. Back in the cell, she sat again, the bench creaking under her weight. The bulb flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door. She wasn't helpless. She never had been. This was a setback, not a surrender. Her mind drifted, pulling up a memory she'd carry into a fake interview later, one we'd stitch into this story for you now. "I felt trapped," she'd say, her voice echoing in your ears, like she's right there with you, not just by the cuffs or the cell, but by the weight of it all, knowing this wasn't new, wasn't rare. It's a system that grinds people down, spits them out. But sitting there, I wasn't broken. I was pissed. And that anger? It's fuel. I knew I wasn't staying in that hole. Not for long. Across town, John Ridley slammed his phone down, his office lit by a single lamp casting long shadows over maps and medals on the wall. He was a big man, gray at the temples, with a stare that could stop a room cold. He didn't pace, just stood there, jaw tight, already dialing the next number. "Get me the base legal team," he growled to someone off screen, his nod sharp and final. Back in that cell, Maya leaned her head against the wall, the concrete cool against her scalp. She closed her eyes, but she wasn't resting, she was planning. Every detail mattered now. Colton's badge number, the time on the clock, the way Ethan had flinched when he'd booked her. She'd use it all, every last piece. The air shifted outside, a faint murmur of voices down the hall. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. Ridley was moving, and that meant wheels were turning, big ones, the kind that crushed arrogance like Colton's under their weight. She opened her eyes, a faint spark lighting them up, fierce and unyielding. "I wasn't scared," she'd tell you in that interview, her tone steady as steel. "I was ready." ready to fight, ready to win, because that's who I am. They picked the wrong woman to mess with that night, and they were about to find out why. The clock ticked on, slow and stubborn, but time didn't matter anymore. She wasn't just a prisoner in that moment, she was a storm waiting to break. Ridley's promise hung in the air, a lifeline she'd grabbed with both hands. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the turning point. The shift from darkness to something brighter, something fierce. Hope wasn't a word she'd throw around lightly, but sitting there, in that cold, flickering cell, she felt it sharp and real, cutting through the shadows. Colton thought he'd buried her. He was wrong, dead wrong, and soon the whole damn world would know it. The courtroom in Tulsa's district courthouse smelled like old wood and tension, the kind that sticks to your skin and hums in your ears. It was morning now, the sun slicing through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Maya Harper stood at the defendant's table, her Air Force uniform crisp despite the hell of the night before. Her wrists still bore faint red marks, a quiet testament to what she'd endured, but her face was a mask of steel, calm, unyielding, ready. The room buzzed with low murmurs, a handful of spectators craning their necks from the back benches. Lawyers shuffled papers, their pens scratching against legal pads. But all eyes kept drifting to her. She wasn't just a woman in cuffs anymore. She was a colonel, a fighter, and today she was here to take back what James Colton had tried to strip away. Across the room, Colton slouched in a chair near the prosecution's table, his uniform swapped for a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, his broad shoulders hunched, his smirk gone, replaced by a twitch in his jaw that betrayed the nerves he couldn't hide. He'd walked into this, thinking it'd be quick, a slap on the wrist, maybe a lecture, but the air felt different. Now, heavier, like the walls were closing in. The bailiff's voice cut through the hum. All rise. Chairs scraped as everyone stood, a ripple of movement that settled fast. Judge Robert Hensley swept in, his black robe billowing like a storm cloud, his face carved from years of seeing too much. He was a man who didn't suffer fools' gray hair, sharp eyes, a gavel that hit like thunder. He took his seat, the wood creaking under him, and nodded. Be seated. Sarah Nguyen stepped up first, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose. She was small but fierce, her dark hair pulled tight, her briefcase snapping open like a gunshot. She didn't waste time on fluff, no grand speeches, just facts, cold and hard. Your Honor, we're here to address the unlawful arrest of Colonel Maya Harper by Officer James Colton. The evidence will show this wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern. David Ortiz followed, his tie slightly crooked, his voice steady as stone. He carried a stack of files that thudded onto the table, each one a brick in the case they'd built overnight. We've got video, Your Honor. Body cam footage from Colton himself. It's damning, and it's not the first time he's done this. He paused, letting that sink in, his eyes flicking to Colton, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The projector hummed to life, a grainy image flickering onto the screen at the front of the room. There it was, the fake traffic stop in all its ugly glory. The camera shook slightly, strapped to Colton's chest, but the audio was crystal clear. Your taillight's out, he barked, his flashlight blinding the lens for a second. Then Maya's voice, calm and firm. It was checked last week. Why am I being stopped? The room went quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs. On screen, Colton's tone sharpened. Step out of the car. Her response came quick. I have a right to know why. And then there it was, the moment it all unraveled. His hand shot out, yanking her arm, the cuff snapping on, the metal glinting under the patrol car's lights. Gasps rippled through the benches, soft but electric. Sarah pointed at the screen, her voice slicing through the stillness. This isn't law enforcement. This is abuse. Colonel Harper wasn't speeding, wasn't resisting, just asking a question. And for that, she was cuffed, dragged to a cell, and humiliated. She turned, her gaze locking on Colton, who stared at the floor, his fingers digging into his palms. Ortiz stepped forward, flipping open one of those files. It gets worse. This is the 5th time in 6 months. Colton's pulled over a black driver with no valid cause. 5 times. Same excuse: taillights, headlights, suspicious behavior. No tickets issued, just detentions. We've got the records, the complaints, the pattern. He slapped the file shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The footage rolled on, showing Colton shoving Maya into the patrol car, his smirk caught in a split-second frame. Someone in the back muttered under their breath, a curse or a prayer. It was hard to tell. Hensley leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, the lines on his face deepening as he watched. He didn't blink, not once, like he was carving every detail into his memory. Sarah took the floor again, her voice rising just enough to carry. This isn't about one bad night. It's about a man who thinks his badge gives him a free pass to terrorize people. Colonel Harper's a decorated officer, served this country with honor, and he treated her like a criminal for no reason but the color of her skin. She paused, letting the weight settle, then turned to the judge. We move to dismiss all charges. Colton's head snapped up, his face paling, a sheen of sweat glinting under the courtroom lights. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to argue, but his lawyer, a wiry guy in a gray suit, grabbed his arm, whispering something sharp. He sank back, his bravado crumbling, his hands curling into fists on the table. Ortiz pulled out a USB drive, holding it up like a trophy. This footage isn't just evidence, it's a wake-up call. Tulsa PD's got a problem, and it starts with him. He nodded at Colton, who flinched, his shoulders curling in like a kid caught stealing. The screen froze on that last frame, Colton's face, smug and unrepentant, now a ghost haunting him in real time. Hensley's gavel hovered, his voice rumbling out slow and deliberate. I've seen enough. The charges against Colonel Harper are dismissed, effective immediately. A murmur swept the room, a wave of relief crashing over the tension. But he wasn't done. Officer Colton, this court's recommending a full internal investigation into your conduct. This stops here. The gavel slammed down, a crack that split the air, final and fierce. Maya exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her shoulders easing just a fraction. Sarah gave her a small nod, a flicker of pride in her eyes. Ortiz stacked his files, a quiet smirk tugging at his lips. Justice didn't just whisper, it roared. Colton sat there, frozen, his face a mask of shock and defiance, crumbling into something smaller, something scared. The camera had stripped him bare, his power dissolving under the weight of his own actions. The benches emptied out, whispers turning to chatter. But Maya stayed still, soaking it in the sound of that gavel, the taste of vindication. This wasn't just her win. It was a crack in the wall, a light breaking through. She'd walked in here a defendant, but she'd walk out a victor, and Colton? He'd carry this day like a scar. The room buzzed around her, but all she felt was the steady beat of her own heart, strong and unbroken. The Tulsa police station was a fortress of brick and steel, but that afternoon it felt more like a cage cracking open. The air inside buzzed with a tension you could taste, sharp, bitter, like burnt coffee left too long on the burner. Word of the courtroom bombshell had spread fast, a wildfire leaping from desk to desk, and now it was time for the fallout to hit. William Grayson stood in his office, the blinds half drawn, letting slivers of cold light spill across his desk. He was a big man, grizzled, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone, years of wrangling cops and chaos etched into every line. His uniform was stiff, the badge on his chest glinting like a warning. He didn't pace, didn't fidget, just stared at the paperwork in front of him, a single sheet that would end a career. James Colton was down the hall, still in that ill-fitting suit from the trial, his tie loosened like he'd given up pretending. He'd been called in straight from court. No time to change, no time to hide. His boots dragged against the linoleum, each step slower than the last, like he knew what was coming but couldn't outrun it. The swagger was gone, replaced by a slump in his shoulders that made him look smaller, diminished. Grayson's pen scratched across the page, the sound cutting through the quiet like a blade. Suspension order, effective immediately. He didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. The ink bled into the paper, bold and final. A mark that said this wasn't up for debate. "He's done," he muttered under his breath, the words more for himself than anyone else. He'd seen too many like Colton cops, who thought the badge was a shield for anything they wanted to do. The door swung open, and Colton shuffled in, escorted by a uniformed officer who didn't meet his eyes. The room felt colder now, the light from the window slicing across Colton's face, catching the sweat beading on his forehead. He stood there, hands stuffed in his pockets, trying to hold on to some shred of defiance. It didn't work. His jaw twitched, his gaze darted to the floor, avoiding the weight of Grayson's stare. "You're off the force," Grayson said, his voice low and hard, like gravel grinding under a tire. "Pending investigation. But don't kid yourself, this isn't temporary. Hand over your badge." He slid the order across the desk, the paper rustling in the stillness. Colton's hand hovered, trembling just enough to notice, before he pulled the badge from his pocket and dropped it. It hit the wood with a dull clank, a sound that echoed like a door slamming shut. Grayson leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight. "You thought you could pull this crap and walk away clean. You were wrong." There was no yelling, no theatrics, just a cold, steady truth that landed heavier than any shout. Colton opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to beg, but nothing came out. His lips pressed into a thin line, his face paling under the fluorescent glow. The walkout was slow, brutal in its silence. Colton moved through the station, head down, eyes fixed on the floor like it could swallow him whole. Officers turned away, some with disgust, some with pity, but none stepped in. His locker stood empty now, someone had already cleared it out. His gear tossed into a box like trash. The exit loomed ahead, glass doors reflecting the pale light, and he pushed through them without a word. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a flat gray that matched the weight on his shoulders. He stopped on the steps, his shadow stretching long and thin across the pavement. A gust of wind tugged at his jacket, but he didn't move, just stood there, head bowed. A man stripped bare by his own choices. The station loomed behind him, a monument to the life he'd torched, and he shuffled off, disappearing into the parking lot like a ghost, fading into fog. Back inside, Grayson sat alone, the badge still on his desk, a dull reminder of the mess he had to clean up. He'd agreed to a fake interview later, one we'd weave in here for you now, his voice steady and gruff as it filled the air. "I've been in this job 25 years, he'd say, the words carrying the weight of every one of those days. "I've seen good cops, bad cops, everything in between. But what Colton did, that's not a mistake, it's a betrayal. Of the badge, of the people we serve." He'd pause, his eyes narrowing like he was staring down the past. "We're not perfect. No force is. But we can't let guys like him fester. I'm here to root that out, every last bit of it. Tulsa deserves better. The folks out there, the ones we're supposed to protect, they deserve better. And I'll be damned if I let this slide." The office was quiet again. The suspension order folded away, the badge locked in a drawer. Grayson stood, his silhouette filling the window as he looked out over the city. This wasn't just about Colton. It was a line in the sand, a promise to the force, to the streets, to every driver who'd ever seen those flashing lights and felt their gut twist. Colton's career was ash now, scattered by the wind that whipped through the lot. He'd climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life, but it didn't matter where he went. The weight of that day clung to him, a shadow he couldn't shake. He'd pushed too far, played his hand too hard, and now the game was over. Grayson's voice lingered in that fake interview, a final note that tied it all together. "This isn't the end of the fight," he'd say, his tone firm, unyielding. "It's the start. We clean house. We rebuild trust. We do the job right. Anything less, and we're no better than he was." The words hung there, a vow carved in stone, a signal that justice didn't just stop, it kept moving, kept cutting through the dark. And out there, Somewhere in Tulsa, a man who'd once held power drove away with nothing, head down, hands empty, the echo of his own downfall ringing in his ears. The circle closed, the punishment landed, and the story rolled on. The air felt lighter now, like the world had taken a deep breath and let it go. Maya Harper stood outside the Tulsa courthouse, the late afternoon sun spilling gold across her face. Her uniform was still sharp, the creases holding strong, despite the chaos of the last 24 hours. She'd walked out of that courtroom with her head high, the echo of the gavel still ringing in her ears, a sound that wasn't just freedom, but vindication. A black SUV rolled up, tires crunching against the curb, the Air Force emblem glinting on its side. The door swung open, and out stepped Colonel John Ridley, his boots hitting the pavement with a thud that carried authority. He was a wall of a man, his gray hair catching the light, his eyes warm but fierce, like a father who'd fight the world for his own. He crossed the distance in a few strides, stopping just short of her, a faint smile breaking through his stern face. "You did it," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind that grounded you no matter how high the stakes. She nodded, a small curve tugging at her lips, her first real smile since those flashing lights had torn her night apart. "We did it," she corrected, her tone soft but firm, a quiet acknowledgement of the man who'd moved mountains from that cell phone call. He clapped a hand on her shoulder, firm and proud. "The Department of Defense is watching this close. They're pissed, and not at you. What happened out there, what Colton pulled, it's got their attention. They're talking inquiries, policy reviews, the works." His words hung there, heavy with promise, a ripple that could stretch far beyond Tulsa's borders. She looked out at the street, the city humming around them, cars rolling by, people moving through their days, oblivious to the storm she'd just weathered. "Good," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's not just about me. It's about every person who's been through this, every driver who's felt that knot in their gut when the lights come on. I want to speak for them." Ridley's eyes softened, a flicker of respect deepening the lines on his face. "You will. They're already asking for you briefings, statements, maybe more. This isn't staying quiet." He paused, glancing at the courthouse behind her, its shadow stretching long across the steps. "You're a hell of a fighter, Maya. Always have been." She let that sink in, the warmth of it settling into her bones. The courthouse doors swung open behind them, a few stragglers spilling out, lawyers, reporters, faces she didn't recognize. Word was spreading, a murmur growing into a roar. She felt it, that shift, like the ground was tilting toward something bigger, something she could shape. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp vibration that snapped her back. She pulled it out, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. "Colonel Harper," she answered, her voice smooth, professional, the way she'd trained it to be. A pause, then a voice crackled through, warm and official. "This is Mayor Ellis, Tulsa. I just heard what went down in there. Wanted to say damn fine job holding your ground." She blinked, caught off guard, but recovered fast. "Thank you, sir. Appreciate that," he chuckled, a sound that carried weight even through the line. "No, thank you. You've got this city talking, and we need that. Stay sharp. I'll be in touch." The call clicked off, leaving her staring at the phone, a quiet glow spreading through her chest. Ridley raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Mayor, huh? You're moving up quick." She slipped the phone back into her pocket, the smile widening just a touch. "Guess so," she said, her gaze drifting to the horizon, where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, warm, alive, a stark contrast to the cold cell she'd left behind. Across town, the story was already breaking wider. Grainy footage flickered on news screens, protests from years past, real ones, where people marched with signs against abuse of power, their voices raw and unfiltered, hands clenched into fists, chants rising into the air, a sea of faces demanding change. It wasn't just Tulsa, it was everywhere, a thread tying her fight to a bigger tapestry. She saw it in her mind. Clear as day, those crowds, those voices, the weight of every story like hers that didn't end in a courtroom win. "I've been lucky," she'd say later, her words slipping into this tale like a quiet confession. "I had rank, resources, people who'd listen. Most don't. That's why I can't stop here. This win, it's theirs too." Ridley stepped back, giving her space to breathe, to feel the moment. The SUV's engine purred behind him, ready to take her back to base, back to a life that'd never be quite the same. She turned to him, her eyes bright, fierce, with a purpose that hadn't been there before, not like this. "I'm not done," she said, her voice a vow, soft but unbreakable. He nodded, a silent agreement sealed between them. "Never thought you were." The sun sank lower, its light wrapping around her like a mantle, warm and steady. She stood there, a silhouette against the glow, a woman who'd faced the dark and come out stronger, not just for herself, but for every soul still waiting for their shot at justice. The mayor's call, the protests, Ridley's faith, it all wove together, a chorus growing louder by the second. She felt it in her bones, a hum that wouldn't fade. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the spark of something new, something vast, and as she took a step forward, that faint smile held, a promise that the fight was far from over. Out there, beyond the courthouse, the world was waking up. Signs would rise again, voices would shout, and her name, Colonel Maya Harper, would echo through it all. A victory, yes, but more than that, a call, a light, a crack in the wall that wouldn't close. Not now, not ever. The dust had settled, but the air still crackled with the weight of what had happened. Maya Harper's story wasn't just a moment, it was a thunderclap, a sound that rolled out from a dark Tulsa road and crashed into the world beyond. It started with flashing lights, a pair of cuffs, and a cop who thought he could bend justice to his will. It ended with a courtroom win, a badge stripped away, and a ripple that wouldn't stop spreading. Think about it. How does a night like that even begin? A woman driving home, tired but steady, her uniform still carrying the pride of years in the Air Force. Colonel Maya Harper wasn't looking for a fight, but one found her anyway. James Colton, with his smirk and his power trip, turned a routine stop into a nightmare. He cuffed her, locked her up, thought he'd walk away clean. He didn't. That cell couldn't hold her. Not really. She called Colonel John Ridley, and the gears started turning fast. By morning, Sarah Nguyen and David Ortiz had torn Colton's lies apart in court, the body cam footage laying his arrogance bare for all to see. Judge Robert Hensley slammed the gavel, and just like that, the charges vanished. Grayson took Colton's badge, and the man who'd strutted out of that station was left with nothing but a shadow to carry. But this isn't just about one woman, one cop, one night. It's bigger, way bigger. Maya walked out of that courthouse a victor, sure. But she carried something else too, a truth that's been screaming for years. Black drivers pulled over twice as often, hands trembling on steering wheels, hearts racing not from guilt but from fear. It's not a headline, it's a reality, etched into lives across this country and beyond. She knew that. Sitting in that cell, staring at those gray walls, she felt it, the weight of every story like hers, every voice that didn't get a courtroom or a colonel to call. That's why she didn't stop at winning. She told Ridley she'd speak out, told the mayor she'd keep pushing. The Department of Defense took notice. Tulsa's streets started buzzing, and somewhere out there, people who'd never met her felt a spark light up. This fight isn't new. Look back, protests filling city blocks, signs waving high, chants echoing off concrete. Real footage, real anger, real hope, hands raised, fists clenched, voices demanding a system that doesn't crush the innocent under its heel. Maya's story slots right into that. A single thread in a tapestry that's still being woven, still growing, still shouting for change. And that's where you come in. Yeah, you listening right now, wherever you are. This isn't just a video to watch and forget. It's a call, a push, a chance to do something. Maya fought her way out of the dark, but she's not the only one still in it. There are others, too many, waiting for their shot at justice, waiting for someone to hear them. So here's what you do. Share this story. Hit that button. Send it out X, TikTok, wherever your voice lives. Let it spread. Let it roar. Tell your friends, your family, the stranger next to you. Say her name, Colonel Maya Harper, and say why it matters. Because every share, every word, every ripple builds something bigger than one courtroom win. But don't stop there. Look around your town, your streets, your world. See the cracks? The places where power twists and justice bends? Step into them. Speak up. Call it out. Join the marches. Sign the petitions. Demand the change that's overdue. It's not just Maya's fight, it's ours. All of ours. And it starts with you. Picture this. Words flash across the screen, bold and bright. Speak up. Justice starts with you. They burn there. A challenge. A promise. A torch passed from her hands to yours. The camera pulls back, and there she is, Maya, standing tall, her uniform catching the light, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She's not looking back, not at the cuffs, not at the cell, just forward, steady and sure. That's the image that lingers. A woman who faced the storm and came out stronger. A spark that lit a fire. She's walking now, steps firm against the earth, the sun dipping low behind her, casting a glow that feels like hope made real. This isn't the end, it's the beginning. A road stretching out, waiting for you to join her. So what's it gonna be? Scroll past and let it fade, or grab this moment and run with it. Maya didn't back down. Neither should you. Share it. Fight for it. Make it loud. Because justice doesn't wait, it moves. And it moves with us. Let's keep it going.